Hi, Lizzie, you can start now.
Very good afternoon and hello everyone. Welcome to the first Asian Law Student Association International Live Video Conference 2020, also known as ALSA IVID 2020. This event is proudly brought to you by ALSA UM alongside ALSA Malaysia and will center around the theme Law, a hindrance or a useful tool in the war against COVID-19. I'm Lizzie John, an Academic and Activities Officer of ALSA UM, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. Joining us today as the main speaker is the esteemed Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, as well as 6 honorable panelists. They are as follows. As representatives from our partnering ALSA International Chapter, Universitas Airlangga, we have the director himself, Mr. Shahril Gunawan, Ms. Silvana Enendita, Manager of External Division, Ms. Dururatul Hikmah, a staff of External Division. As representatives from the ALSA UM local chapter, we'll have Mr. Ui Guo Shen, followed by Ms. Natalie Zhong, who are both fellow academic and activities officers, and finally, myself. Further, we will also be enjoying the presence of a representative from ALSA Malaysia, Ms. Bhuvanesh Ramesh, Director of Academic Publications. For your information, the event will begin with a brief background introduction, followed by an individual presentation by Dr. Jomo. After that, all 6 panelists will convene in a moderated panel discussion for a live Q&A session. As such, we would be delighted to hear from you, the audience, so feel free to drop us your burning questions regarding the topic today in the comment section to be answered during the live Q&A session later on. But before anything else, let's invite both representatives from ALSA Malaysia and ALSA Universitas Airlangga to say a few words. Firstly, I'd like to call upon the representative of ALSA Malaysia, Ms. Bhuvanesh Ramesh, Director of Academic Publications, to give her opening remarks.
Bhuvanesh, you're unmuted. Your mic's muted.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lizzie. Greetings, everyone. I'm Bhuvanesh Ramesh from ALSA Malaysia, and I'm the Director of Academic Publications. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone for today's IVID session. ALSA Malaysia International Video Conference, which is also known as IVID, is an online conference where an online discussion is held between the local chapters participated by the Malaysian students and also between the international chapter students. This program is initiated by ALSA Malaysia and co-partnership with other local chapters and international chapters in charge. IVID is an initiative taken by the ALSA Malaysia to create awareness and also to identify the current legal position of Malaysia or any other international chapters on specific issues. Apart from being a bridge to connect local chapters, ALSA Malaysia has set up this platform to bring the exchange of knowledge to an international level as well. I would like to thank ALSA University of Malaya and ALSA Universitas Airlangga for organizing this IVID session today on behalf of ALSA Malaysia. Moreover, I would also like to thank Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is our speaker today, for being able to attend this program in order to share your profound insights on today's topic, which is law, a hindrance or a useful tool in the war against COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bhuvanesh, for that warm welcome. Next, I'd like to call forth the Director of ALSA Universitas Airlangga, Mr. Shahril Gunawan, to present his opening speech.
Thank you for the time and the opportunity. Greetings, everyone, to the Honorable Professor Dr. Jomo as a speaker of this event, to the Honorable Ms. Bhuvanesh Ramesh as a Director of Academic Publication, ALSA Malaysia and the Board, to the Honorable Ms. Florence Jip from ALSA University of Malaya and the Board, to the Honorable Ms. Lizzie Zon as Moderator, and to the Honorable all committee and participants of this event. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let's praise Mighty God who give us blessing and thousands of favor so that we can gather in this event, international video conference. I'm Syahrul Gunawan as Director of ALSA Local Chapter Universitas Airlangga, Indonesia. Want to say thank you very much to ALSA University of Malaya and ALSA Malaysia. It is an honor for me that ALSA Legionnaire invited to join this event. It is a good platform to discuss about the legal issue between prospective local chapters and international chapters. I hope this event make all participants create awareness and better understanding on specific issues and also make a good critical discuss and the legal solutions. Last but not least, I hope this event build better connection and relation between local chapter and international chapter, especially for ALSA University of Malaya, ALSA Malaysia, and ALSA Local Chapter Universitas Airlangga, Indonesia. That's all from me. Thank you for your opportunity and the time. ALSA, always be one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shahrul, for that pleasant speech. We hope that all participants will enjoy today's conference. Now that we have covered the formalities, let's kickstart the conference with a little background introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, COVID-19 has taken the world by storm, infecting at least 16 million individuals globally and leaving behind over 500,000 dead in its wake. Akin to other major countries, a domino effect ensued in Malaysia, leading up to almost 9,000 reported cases and over 100 deaths nationwide. This led to the enactment of the Prevention and Control of Diseases Act 1988, which creates new regulations and offences enforceable with the assistance of the police force. Subsequently, the Malaysian government started imposing strict control measures like the Movement Control Order or MCO, which placed the entire country on lockdown, save for essential services, to curb the spread and ameliorate the situation. Violators were subjected to a fine of 1,000 ringgit or 6 months imprisonment. Similarly, Indonesia suffered from almost 117,000 confirmed cases and over 5,000 deaths. This triggered the issuance of Government Regulation Number 21/2020 by President Joko Widodo on PSBB, Pembatasan Sosial Berskala Besar or large-scale social distancing. This led to the implementation of the 2018 Health Quarantine Law, which restricts movement within a control zone and focuses on namely home, hospital, and regional quarantine. Violators can be criminally charged pursuant to Article 93 of the Health Quarantine Law, which carries a maximum of 1 year's imprisonment and or a fine worth 100 million rupiah, which is roughly around 29,000 for fellow Malaysians. Dear audience, although the measures were admittedly effective at curbing the spread of the disease, both the nation's production rate and revenue had fallen considerably as a result. The orders also gave rise to an array of legal issues which plagued businesses. For instance, delay or inability to fulfill contractual obligations, disruptions to the supply of goods and large-scale retrenchments. Despite the government's efforts in taking several fiscal and non-fiscal measures, the World Bank had slashed Malaysia's GDP growth rate from 4.5% to negative 0.1% in 2020, whereas the IMF predicted that Indonesia's economic growth would plunge to 0.5% this year from a 4-year low of 5.02% in 2019. In light of these dire circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, there have been multiple calls for a comprehensive COVID-19 bill to address the multifaceted issues arising from the pandemic. This then begs the question, which also happens to be the theme of our session today: law, a hindrance or a useful tool in the war against COVID-19. As nations struggle with recovery, long-term policy implications will be key determinants to our economic fate. Will law be a practical vehicle in creating a more sustainable and resilient nation in surviving the new normal, or will it merely hinder and hamper progress? These are some of the pertinent issues that we hope to cover in today's event. Now, let me introduce our distinguished main speaker of today's conference. Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram is a prominent and accomplished Malaysian economist who played an integral role in forming the nation's economic landscape. Renowned as the leading scholar and expert on the political economy of development, especially in Southeast Asia, Dr. Jomo has authored, edited, and translated over 100 books, as well as written various academic papers and articles for the media. Furthermore, Dr. Jomo, a major player in the international, having worked on numerous global economic initiatives in proximity of United Nations. Currently, Dr. Jomo serves as a senior advisor at Khazanah Research Institute and a visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University. Without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I call upon Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram to enlighten us on the topic at hand today.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for this kind words of introduction, and thank you to ALSA for this invitation. I'm going to speak about law primarily. I have to admit that I'm a failed law student because I didn't complete, I started doing a correspondence course in law, but after my father passed away, I didn't have time to attend to it. But that was a long time ago. Let me emphasize that most of us, many of us, and many of you probably went to study law because you think you're going to do, it has something to do with justice. The symbols of law and the symbols of justice are often interchangeable. The symbol of the Barisan National Ruling Coalition, former ruling coalition in Malaysia, is the scales of justice, and so the idea, the basic appeal of the law is its association with justice. I would like to suggest to you, however, that law is actually the prerogative very often of those with power. It is power which power which makes law, and law which enhances power. And so this allows us to have a very different view of law itself. Let me begin with a couple of examples from the colonial period, one which might appeal to our friends in Indonesia as well. The father of international law is normally said to be a man named Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius was born and grew up in Holland with the name Huig de Groot. Huig de Groot was a child prodigy. At a very young age, he was already writing legal opinions. And as a teenager, he wrote a legal opinion defending the takeover of a Portuguese ship by a ship belonging to the Dutch East India Company. This happened very near to what is now Singapore, a place called Piedra Branca, near an island called Piedra Branca. And so what we find is that the general association of law with justice has actually very little to do in this particular case, at least. So this man, Huig de Groot, later had some problems with his patrons in Holland, and he had to leave Holland. And he went to Paris, and he reinvented himself. He took on a Latin name, and hence Huig de Groot became Hugo Grotius. This is the main reason why the Netherlands, until today, tries to ensure that all the major international law organizations have their headquarters in Den Haag, the capital of Holland. It is because of their claim to this association with international law. But I would like to remind you with this particular example that perhaps it is less than a glorious association with Mr. Hugo Grotius and how he developed his reputation. A second example I'd like to give you is from Singapore, from our part of the world. As many of you may know, the Dutch East Indies Company captured much of the Riau Sultanate. The Riau Sultanate extended from the islands of Riau to Lingga in southern Sumatra, as well as Singapore. And the Dutch East Indies Company managed to get most of the territory except for Singapore and Johor. And so the Riau Sultan was driven and had to hide in Singapore. In 1819, as you probably know, Mr. Stamford Raffles, or Sir Stamford Raffles, arrived in Singapore and made a deal. You have to remember that Raffles knew next to nothing about Singapore. He was not really interested in Singapore. His main interest was in Java, and he wrote a very famous book called The History of Java. He was also very interested in zoological and botanical specimens from this part of the world, and late was involved in the establishment of the London Zoo, for example. But the Singapore, in the case of Singapore, Mr. Raffles arrived and made a deal with the Riau. The deal was to establish a factory for the processing of certain spices to be exported to the West. That was the deal, nothing more than that. But today, when you read accounts of when Singapore was founded, it was supposedly founded by Stamford Raffles in 1819 with this particular signing of this agreement. Now, the Sultan was not very pleased with all this, but in 1824, long after the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, the prince, or rather the stadtholder of the House of Orange, the ruling house in the Netherlands, had gone after Napoleon's invasion, excuse me, invasion of Holland. He had gone and sought refuge in London and had become actually the king of the king there by marrying the queen. They wanted Britain wanted a king, and they got a king who was imported. So this is how Britain got the king, and so after the Napoleon was safely out of the way and so on, there was an Anglo-Dutch treaty in 1824, and the Anglo-Dutch treaty agreed that the islands of what are now Indonesia would become Dutch property, and what is now Johor and Singapore would be basically under British influence. You have to remember, at that time in this part of the world, Britain was actually relatively weak compared to the Dutch, so the Dutch were in a better bargaining position. But over the course of the 19th century, Britain became increasingly powerful, and the Dutch influence declined relatively. And so Britain wanted instead, so the Dutch had captured much of the Riau Sultanate, as I told you, before 1819, thanks to the help they got from Bugis. So the Bugis basically working with the Dutch against the Malays of Riau. But later on, the situation changed. And when the Sultan of Riau, who was stationed in Singapore, refused to cooperate with the British, the British began to support the Bugis instead. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is that if you think about power and the interpretation of law, all this has to do with the interpretation of law. You cannot make a case for Singapore today on the basis of the 1819 contract between the East India Company and the Sultan of Riau. Now, there are many other instances of all this. Now, you might say, okay, that was all in the past during the colonial period and so on, but I think there are many other examples which you can think of. Think of the concept of limited liability. A company which is limited has limited liability under the law in both Malaysia as well as Indonesia and in much of Southeast Asia. Now, what does this basically imply? Limited liability basically means a limited responsibility. Now, consider, for example, the case of Union Carbide. Union Carbide used to make batteries, among other things. And Union Carbide, very famously in the 1980s, had a factory in India in a place called Bhopal. And there was an explosion in the factory, and about 250,000 people eventually died. Many others were very, very seriously wounded. But to this day, there has not been any compensation paid. Okay? There has not been any compensation paid because of the questions of limited liability. And certainly the owners of the company who could make a lot of money when things were going well were not in a position to make that kind of money after this situation. They obviously, if they had liability, if they had responsibility for the operations which led to making profits, they should also have responsibility for those very same operations which resulted in that tragedy. So you can see how limited liability limits the responsibility of corporate entities. But corporate entities are increasingly treated as if they are humans and have rights as humans. So they have rights, but not the responsibilities or duties. Now, let me come to something which are much more directly relevant to COVID-19. As you all know, the pandemic is believed to have started in East Asia, particularly in Wuhan City, which is the industrial center of China for almost a century, at least a century now. Now, Wuhan City, the crisis, the virus supposed to have developed there, and many people were infected. But in China, outside of Wuhan and the 3 surrounding provinces, and in the rest of East Asia, in Japan, in Taiwan, in Korea, even in Vietnam and Laos and Kerala province in southwestern India, you find that there was no stay-in-shelter lockdown imposed. Okay, stay-in-shelter lockdown was not imposed in those places. In China, in the 3 provinces around Wuhan City, it was imposed, but not in the rest of China. The point I want to make is that the emergency measures require enabling legislation which allows that kind of so-called state of emergency to be made possible. But in the case of those Northeast Asian countries, there were emergency measures, the emergency preventive and precautionary measures, but they did not involve a stay-in-shelter lockdown. Unfortunately, the rest of the world, with notable exceptions such as Kerala state in India, ignored the information which was available, the victims which were mounting in this part of the world, and basically did not take precautionary measures. So the question is, who bears responsibility for this? These are very difficult questions in the law, okay, and one needs to think about it. But at the same time, the suspension of law for the imposition of certain emergency measures is always partial. One has to recognize this. And I'll come back to this point later, because when you try to consider the consequences of the crisis and how to deal with the crisis, this becomes a very, very important consideration. So let me move quite directly now to thinking about 2 areas of the law which have come up, and I'm dealing now primarily with international commercial law, which have tremendous relevance for us. The first is the question of so-called intellectual property rights. Many of you who study the law think or see property rights as part and parcel of law. But it's important to recognize that not all societies have been organized on the basis of property rights. Property rights are a relatively recent creation in different parts of the world. And it's important to recognize that the creation of property rights basically has very, very important implications for it has very important implications for the rights of property owners, of asset owners. Now, property rights have even historically extended to people. That's what slavery is about. People becoming slaves are people who are property are slaves. Or you have more modified versions of that. You can have debt slaves. You can have what are called in a word which has come from the Spanish language, a peon, a debt slave, indentured labor. So during the period of that indenture, you basically are a slave for all intents and purposes. You may have the theoretical right to free yourself, but for all practical purposes, you may not actually be able to free yourself. Now, many of you probably don't remember, because you know very few people are paying attention to it. But next year, 2021, 500th anniversary of Magellan being assassinated. I do not say that Magellan went around the world, because he actually was assassinated in a place called in the central Philippines, in the Visayas, in an island called Mactan. But with the act of his assassination, his will allowed for a slave whom he had bought in Malacca. Okay, around 1511, he bought a slave in Malacca. The slave is believed, according to the chronicler, a man named Antonio Pigafetta. According to Pigafetta, the slave was probably from Sumatra. Okay, so this slave, who was given the name Enric because the main patron of the ship, of the voyages of navigation for Portugal, was a prince called Enric or Enrique. Okay, so the slave was given the name Enric, and he followed Magellan. Okay, his Portuguese name was Magalhães, and went back. And for various reasons, he was not the king of Portugal did not want to sponsor Magellan to go around the world. So Magellan went and saw the king of Spain, and he got the king of Spain to sponsor his thing. Now, so he went around the world, as we know, but before he could complete that voyage, he died in the Visayas. And Enric, who was then liberated by the terms of the will, becomes the first, is freed. And you can basically argue that a slave was the first to go around the world. But let us not glamorize slavery. I think it is very important to recognize that today there are still millions of people around the world who are treated as if they are property. And this, I think, is a very unfortunate situation in which we live. But it's very important for us to recognize that this is a major problem. And this particularly is relevant because of the treatment of undocumented migrant workers. Okay, so many migrant workers are documented. And as you all know, in Singapore, the so-called second wave of COVID-19 cases was largely to be found in what they call the migrant worker cluster. What does this basically mean? In Singapore, the workers are not basically almost all foreign workers, migrant workers, are there legally. Okay. Now in Malaysia, however, many of them are not legal, and many of the migrant workers are, some of them are from Indonesia, some of them are from Bangladesh, and so on. And they have very few rights, especially if you are not documented. If you are not documented, you have even weaker rights than the documented migrant workers. And so what this basically implies is that documentation is a form of legal recognition, but since their rights are less than those of ordinary Malaysian workers, they an underclass. So you can see how questions such as those of property rights and so on have a continued implications for us today. Many of you are unlikely to go into labor law, and It's not a very glamorous area, or very few people actually go and fight for labor rights and so on and so forth. Nobody is going to be able to afford to pay you very well. And in fact, it's more likely that you'll be paid by the employers of these people. The related issue, of course, is a relatively recent category called intellectual property rights. Let us remember that when the International Trade Organization was first mooted to be created in 1948, there was absolutely nothing said about intellectual property rights. It was only at the end of the 20th century that the question of intellectual property rights was to be enforced internationally. And I want to emphasize this because right now, a very major impediment in terms of access to the possible vaccine, in terms of access to treatment, in terms of access to personal protective equipment, in terms of access to testing methods and so on and so forth, a very major impediment is cost. And the costs are raised because of the monopoly rights, which is basically what you get when you have a patent. So intellectual property rights are a huge area which are very, very lucrative, especially for the giant companies which own many of these property rights. Now, some people say that, oh, without this intellectual property rights, there would be no incentive to innovate, etc., etc. This is completely untrue, but I don't have time to get into all that right now. But I think it's very important to recognize you don't take these arguments for granted. And now there are attempts to extend the scope of intellectual property rights. So, for example, there is a dispute among some Malaysian politicians over of the something called the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was an idea originally mooted by President Obama, and President Trump withdrew from the original agreement for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now. But the remaining 11 countries, including Malaysia, but not Indonesia, have signed on to this, okay? Have signed on to this. And I have basically been arguing for years that it is not to Malaysia's advantage to be party to this. But one of the major areas, major reasons why not in the interest of either Malaysians or Indonesians, is precisely because the strengthening of intellectual property rights has caused the price of medicines and other equipment to rise incredibly. Now, you're all young people and you don't remember the late 1990s, but the middle 1990s. But the 1990s was a period when there was a president in South Africa named Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela had been in jail for almost 3 decades. And he came out and he was a man who commanded tremendous prestige. And after being elected president in 1994, he got the South African government to insist on a public health exception to intellectual property rights law. So there's a very important exception to the intellectual property rights law. And so the intellectual property rights law, which operates internationally, yeah, I'm not talking about national law now, is something called TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. And the exception to that is this thing called the public health exception. So under the provisions of the public health exception, countries are able and allowed to manufacture certain types of medicines, etc., at their own cost. They can ignore the licenses which are held by companies. But this the ability to exercise the law currently is actually very much constrained, because pharmaceutical companies are very, very powerful, and they pay lawyers all over the place to bully countries. And these countries basically dare not do so. I'll give you an example from the time you were very young children. In around 15 years ago, there was a threat of avian flu carried by birds. And this threat was very serious, particularly in Asia, but of course in other countries, other places as well, because of course birds can fly long distances, as you know, migratory birds. But when birds fly during migration, they fly north to south or south to north. They do not fly east to west. So the only part of the world which was actually safe from avian flu were the Americas, because birds were not going to fly across the Atlantic or the Pacific. But the only country which was able to buy a vaccine, manufacture a vaccine under the public health exception was the United States of America. Okay, many other countries tried, but they were bullied by the pharmaceutical companies. In this case, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, which had the rights to Tamiflu, and so they didn't manufacture this. So the irony is that the only part of the world which did not have a problem with avian flu had all the supplies which were cheaply available, because no other country could manufacture it. Let me give you another example from a few years ago. Some of you might remember it. There was a young man in his 30s. You might not consider that too young, but anyway, he was in his 30s. His name was Martin Shkreli. Martin Shkreli had made a lot of money very young through very dubious methods. And he bought the rights to a drug. Okay, he bought the rights to a drug which was very, very much needed. And he raised the price of the drug by 6,000%. From $12.50 to $750. Okay, I'm talking about US dollars. Okay, $12.50 to $750. So basically, this 6,000% increase was done simply because he could do it. He had the right to do it under the law. And in the US, there is no law to prevent what the Americans call price gouging. Anybody can set the price once they have the monopoly power, as long as the monopoly power does not contravene some other law. And this is exactly what he did. Now, that's the case of Martin Shkreli. Now, so you can't even rely on the law of the US to protect prices for the rest of the world, okay? Now, in the case of Malaysia, about 2 years ago, the Malaysian government started importing a treatment for hepatitis C. Hepatitis C is quite common. Malaysia has a population of about 30 plus million, and there are almost 500,000 people with this. That means over 1% of the population, less than 2%, but over 1% of the population has hepatitis C. Okay, and these people with hepatitis C, basically, so the treatment for hepatitis C, which is available from the United States, costs over $68,000 for 12-week treatment. The Egyptians have come up with their own generic equivalent, which is not 100% the same, but it is very effective. And it is sold by the Egyptian company to Malaysia for 1,300 ringgit. Okay, now look at that difference. Okay, 68,000, which is almost 300,000 ringgit, compared to 1,300 ringgit. Okay, so there are many other instances, and we can just go through all these examples. But the point I'm trying to make here is that a patent, intellectual property rights, gives the owner of the patent a monopoly. And that monopoly is likely to be abused when the owner of the patent can abuse it. And this is a very, very, very major impediment in terms of access to medicines and so on and so forth. Obviously, you cannot, you really need to be able to deal with this problem. And already now there are, as you know, probably over 100 different groups researching and trying to develop a vaccine. And everybody is trying to be the first to develop the vaccine. And the main intent for many of these groups, unfortunately, is to be able to sell that vaccine to a big pharmaceutical company for to make a lot of money. And the pharmaceutical company will in turn basically make a lot of money with that. Already, for example, Moderna, a company based in Boston, has announced that they are going to sell the vaccine for about $50 to $60 US. Okay, the others have announced that they will sell. They haven't even developed the vaccine, mind you, yeah, or it hasn't even been proved. But if they get it, this is the price they're offering to sell to. And companies in the West and Japan have basically bought already ordered vaccines to be able to protect their populations. So we have a situation where a very, very important impediment to the improvement of public health, especially in the case of COVID-19, is precisely the system of intellectual property rights, of patents, which we face right now. Let me go to one other area because I think it's also very important. Our governments and many governments in the world have made either bilateral or plurilateral. Okay, plurilateral means more than two countries. Okay, bilateral is basically between two countries. So usually you have bilateral treaties, say perhaps between between Indonesia and Japan, or or between Malaysia and some other country. But when you do a number of other countries, maybe in ASEAN, you might call it a plurilateral treaty. So there are many types of treaties, of course, and the two types of treaties which should interest us are either investment treaties or trade agreements. Okay. Now, you have to remember that investment treaties tend to be about investment issues, but trade agreements are about much, much more than trade. They include questions such as property rights and so on and so forth. So in the case of ISDS, okay, the term, I repeat, investor-state dispute settlement, it basically endows a company, a foreign company, with the right to sue a government. Okay. Now let us say that you have made an agreement between your government and a foreign company. Okay. And that company believes that something you have done has undermined their profits. They can sue the government concerned. Okay. Not only for past profits, but also for future profits. Notional profits, they are not necessarily profits which have been made, but which they claim could have been made. Okay. So for example, if you have made a contract to import plastic waste, and the government says, no more plastic waste to be imported into this country, the company which has basically built a business to process plastic waste can sue the government.
Doctor, 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. And so this possibility of suing the government becomes extremely important in enabling governments to in enabling government to have extra judicial rights. Okay, now the point is, when you sue, normally when, let us say you have a problem with me, Lizzie feels that I've been talking for too long and I violated some contract, she can sue me, right? She can sue me, but she would sue me in a national court, right? But in this case, there's no international court for this purpose. And in the past, there was something called the dispute settlement mechanism in the World Trade Organization. But that dispute settlement mechanism in the World Trade Organization is now dysfunctional. Why? Because the judges for that tribunal have basically have not been appointed. Why? Because the US is able to exercise veto power to prevent the appointment. It didn't begin with Mr. Trump. It began earlier with Mr. Obama. But the point is that you have a dysfunctional system, so what happens? Okay? In any case, that is only for state-to-state relations. But in this case, investor-state relations, they will sue you and you go to arbitration. In the case of arbitration, even if the government wins, it still has to pay. All the costs have to be paid for, okay? And you have just a couple of hundred people in the world who are involved in this kind of high-level arbitration. And so basically, let us say you, Lizzie, and I, and a third person, okay? The three of us, we just basically take turns. One day we are the judges. One day we are arguing the case for one side. Another time we are arguing the case for the other side. So you basically have a small coterie of people who basically serve each other's interests. And this is the kind of system which we have in terms of resolving ISDS issues. So it's a very corrupt system, yeah, because you know that if you're too tough on the other side, you probably won't get any more business. Okay, so this is the way that system works. So in the case, let me give you a case. The very famous case was the case of Philip Morris. Philip Morris is a very famous cigarette company, and Philip Morris sued the government of Australia because the government of Australia insists that cigarette packages have these public health messages with messages such as smoking kills, and then they will have a photograph of the inside of a lung with all the tar on the package. And so this basically is intended to discourage people from smoking. But Philip Morris sued the government of Australia and was winning at almost every level until it got to the Supreme Court, and then they lost. Okay, but just imagine if it had gone to arbitration, and Philip Morris has unlimited resources, virtually, and could just keep on suing it, and sue and sue and sue. So just imagine if it was a small government like Laos, or a relatively poor government like Cambodia. Okay, you can see that even Indonesia and Malaysia are not does not have the unlimited resources which are needed to protect yourself. So you can see that this system of investor-state dispute settlement is a system which is rigged in favor of the investors to protect the interests of investors. Now, why is this important? Because to deal with COVID-19, many governments have taken extraordinary measures. So for example, if you say because of the requirements of so-called physical distancing, your workers cannot go to office anymore, or go to the factory anymore and are not able to produce, the company can then claim that they are losing money. Okay, they are losing money and therefore sue the government for the loss of profits because of the stay in shelter lockdown measures which are imposed. So there are many such possibilities. Let me give you another example, which does not involve international law, but which is still very relevant. For example, let us say I'm a big a property owner, and all of you have taken leases from me for property. But during the lockdown, you don't have any income. Okay, you don't have any income. So how are you going to pay for property, for the lease which you have already signed a contract to pay for? Okay, so these are the different places you might resolve these issues differently. The point is that it makes it very, very difficult for businesses to resume activity after the lockdown is over or as the economy begins to pick up, precisely because in addition to the difficulties of starting up again, you have all these accumulated losses which have piled up because of certain contracts which you have already signed on, assuming that you would not have such a measure. So this is why it is very, very important to be able to have greater flexibility in the law. If you look at, for example, British law on bankruptcy and American law on bankruptcy, you know that at one point, almost all the major American airlines were technically bankrupt except for Delta. All the other airlines were bankrupt, but they were operating for many, many years because bankruptcy was simply a way of deferring priority in terms of payment obligations. Okay, I hope you understand what I'm saying. So you, instead of paying off all the accumulated debts, you say, no, I have to pay off certain things first. Otherwise, I will not be able to get my petrol. I will not be able to get workers and so on and so forth. So the business is able to continue to operate and hopefully be able to work itself out of a very difficult situation. Now, this is the kind of challenge which we need. And this is why the law can be a very major impediment, or it can become much, much more conducive towards economic recovery. So these are just some examples which I hope will help you to think about how you as law students can begin to think about how the law affects economic life in many profound ways. So much so that very often most people take it for granted. They don't even think about this as something which is extraordinary, is exceptional, is recently created, as if it is not permanent. Many instruments, financial instruments and so on, have just been created recently. So I hope all this allows you to think about these issues, and I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I hope I have been clear enough. I tried to use some simple examples, but I hope they have been clear enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Jomo, for such a learned, profound, and compendious presentation. I'm sure we've all picked up something new today. You have truly opened our eyes to the economic realities of the world. Now, let's move on to the eagerly anticipated live Q&A session. So first off, I have a few questions myself, if you don't mind, Dr. Jomo. Okay, so my first question would be in relation to how you mentioned about the way costs are becoming an impediment for many parties, right? So with the ongoing pandemic, unemployment remains as one of the core economic woes in the eyes of the public, especially when large-scale retrenchments are occurring left and right. Individuals most affected tend to consist of low-skilled or informal workers. They might barely have even 2 pennies to rub together to shelter necessary costs to survive this, right? So what are your personal thoughts on this particular issue?
I thought you had a few questions. You're going to ask me one by one, or?
You would like me to continue? Okay. So my second and final question would be in regards to how IP rights have become or have risen to be a very lucrative matter in current circumstances, right? So with the advent and increasing popularity of platforms such as Instagram, Grab, and Shopee, many Malaysian SMEs now more than ever have shifted or prioritized their business platforms online in order to adapt and survive the economic fallout caused by the pandemic. So in relation to this, what further measures should be identified in order to increase levels of digitalization to impactfully boost the economy and to prevent the sort of monopoly that you've described earlier from occurring? That's all for me. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. Let me say, as far as the different countries have dealt with the first issue rather differently. Some countries have been, Western countries, for example, have given priority to trying to ensure that employees continue to have some kind of income, not 100% of the income, but and so the emphasis has been very much in the rich countries on ensuring that the workers continue to get some kind of income. And as far as possible, to discourage employers from firing the workers. So there has been a lot of income support subsidies from governments to employers to keep them going. Now, as your question correctly points out, unfortunately, many people do not have that kind of formal labor contract, employment contract. As you know, I hope our friends from Indonesia understand what I'm saying, but there are contracts of labor and contracts for labor. Okay, so these are different types of employment contracts. So many people, especially in the gig economy, they like to think of themselves as being very, very independent, and so they're not very concerned about, you know, actually having a permanent employment, of paying EPF and things like that. You know, they have a very different view, and maybe more young people are open to those kinds of things. For older generation people, employment security is very important. For older people, income security is important, and so on and so forth. So you have very different views, you know, about what would be desirable. In Malaysia, and I'm sorry I don't know the situation in Indonesia, but in Malaysia, about half the labor force is in the so-called formal sector. Okay, about half the labor force are not in the formal sector. In fact, I believe that this is really an underestimate. I would say that the formal sector is probably about a third rather than half, because if you look at the size of the labor force in Malaysia today, we have about 33 million people, and the size of the labor force is probably around 15, 16 million people. And the number of foreign workers in this country is estimated to be around 7 million. Okay, so that's about 30%. Okay, 7 million is about 30%. And as I said, and about 2/3 of those 7 million are not even are not documented. So only about 2.2 million of the foreign workers are documented. Okay, but documented doesn't mean they're living in a life of luxury, but it means that their conditions are probably better off than those who are not documented. So so all those who are undocumented, you can presume don't have any kind of protection. So for many of them, they have actually lost incomes, and then the criminalization of their presence. And discouraging them from coming forward. For example, if you're a migrant worker and you suspect that you might have been exposed to COVID-19 and you want to come forward, but then you hear that, you know, some politician or some minister saying, no, if you come forward, we are going to charge you 500 ringgit. Now, that 500 ringgit is probably more than half of what you earn every month. Okay, to think about paying 500 ringgit for a test is something which is not exactly a priority. So nobody is going to come forward in those circumstances. So in Singapore, as I mentioned earlier, many of the people were actually migrant workers, and even though they were documented and therefore not illegal, yet they were reluctant to come forward because they feared that they would be kicked out of the country if they were found to be infected. So there are a lot of reasons why they are deterred from coming forward, and this is why some of us have been advocating that any worker who's undocumented who comes forward should be actually get, number one, you get free testing, and number two, you get a one year work permit, okay, automatically. A renewable 1 year work permit. You may not be renewed if the employment situation gets worse, but at least you get a renewable 1 year permit. So you feel a certain, you are incentivized to come forward. Okay, so, but the question you raise is actually a bigger question. What about the Malaysians? Okay, about, as I said, about half are not even in the formal sector, and many of them are self-employed. All the people running little businesses and so on, they're all self-employed. And then you have a lot of people whom most of us don't pay very much attention to, but are very essential parts of society, who are doing work, usually what are called daily rated workers. They are paid on a daily basis. You work, you get paid. You don't work, you don't get paid. So for example, when I was a student, all the city council workers were actually considered to be employees of the city council. Today, all the people who clear your trash and so on and so forth, they don't work for the city, for Dewan Bandaraya or the city council. They work for a contractor. Okay, so their terms of employment are doubly precarious. One, because they are not working for the city council, but secondly, they are working for a contractor, not even for the and they're working on a daily rated basis. You don't show up, you don't get paid. So this is a major issue. So for all those people who could not go forward to get paid, to seek employment, they were basically had no incomes during this entire period. Okay, so unless there were relatives and so on and so forth which were able to support them, this became very, very serious. I'm not sure what the situation was like in Indonesia, but if you look at what happened in India, they were given 4 hours notice, and many people were so afraid of what was going to happen to them. They were not going to be able to work, no incomes. They started walking to their home villages. Sometimes they would have to walk 30 hours non-stop, and many of them were brutalized, were beaten, and so on and so forth. Because this is how the problem was dealt with. Now, I hope that this didn't happen in Indonesia. Thankfully, it didn't happen here, but still, there was very, very little time for people to adjust to the. So the point, your question, Lizzie, is very correct, especially for the daily rated workers and the self-employed workers for whom very little was being done. If you look at the so-called Prihatin package, which was introduced by the government in March, it really had very little for such people. There were, of course, a few things there which actually did reach the. I think many of the poor people in the country did get something. I'm not suggesting they got absolutely nothing, but they got far, far less than their normal incomes. And as you know, even in normal circumstances, many poor people are already in debt. The legendary Alongs are collecting debt from them at very usurious rates all the time. So this question you raised is very, very important. Now, in a place like Kerala, actually, the way the whole Prihatin package, of course, they didn't call it Prihatin in Kerala, was designed to reach the poorest people. And so you find that you can't design a package in a way to help the most vulnerable rather than to help the biggest companies, to subsidize the biggest companies, as did happen has happened in many countries in the world, including Malaysia, where there were wage subsidies given to keep the workers on package. In fact, I have even met people who said they're keeping these workers, but as soon as the subsidy from the government is over, they're going to fire the workers. So I'm not even sure it really helps the workers very much. Now, the other thing, the other question is about the IP rights. I think the IP rights, it's very difficult to generalize because there are many different types of firms, many different types of IP rights, how the IP rights costs are transferred and so on and so forth depends very much. But I think the less IP rights you actually protect, the better it is. If you look, for example, at the case of China, you find that almost everybody is using what do you call those things, where you basically, I remember going to China last year, and I was quite shocked to see even a beggar. Well, he was sort of a performing beggar, if you know what I mean. A beggar had a little card where you basically could take a photograph and transfer from your account to the beggar's account. Now, I'm not asking that everybody goes that way, but the fact of the matter is that you want to enable ordinary people. Right now, for example, yesterday I was driving somewhere and I had to hand over my driving license. And the possibility for physical contact with plastic, which is a very good way of infecting people, is unnecessarily high, So you have a lot of measures which are supposed to be COVID-19 preventive measures, which are actually making life much more difficult, which are actually opening up new possibilities for infection. So you close one problem, but you open up another problem. So we have to be far, far more innovative. But I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your second question because the nature of the IP rights concern are actually quite different.
Thank you very much for entertaining my questions, Professor Jomo. Dr. Jomo. I think you gave very insightful answers. So now let's move on to questions that have been asked by other panelists. So I can see right here that the director, Shahrir Gunawan, has a question. What do you think about consequences regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the relation between the COVID-19 pandemic and international environmental law?
Okay. This is a tricky one. I mean, everybody has, all of you, I'm sure, know about how much plastic is being used now, increased use of this, but frankly, there's very little international environmental law on plastics. I used to joke, that the two largest, this thing called the CPTPP, where you have a trade deal with many of these countries in the region. The two major imports which would increase with the CPTPP would be, number one, cars, mainly from Japan, because Australia and so on don't produce cars. And the other thing was actually plastic. But if you look at plastics, actually a lot of it is plastic waste. So who is sending us plastic waste? Even now, the number one source of plastic waste in Malaysia is Japan. Number two is Australia. Number three is Singapore. So we'll be importing plastic waste and happily thinking that we are actually importing plastic when you actually do not have a separate category for plastic waste. So, but that's not a question of international environmental law, I mean, you're creating a problem of pollution, and it's a very unfortunate problem. You look what the people in Kerala have done actually is very, very interesting. They cannot afford much, and I think for many people, poor people in Indonesia, this same practice should be used. They cannot afford much, so they take the old saris and they tear it up and they put usually four layers, okay? Because the way you fold it is four layers. It's always multiple of two, and you basically cover your face. Okay, and you look like, you know, in the old, in the 1940s American films, you know, like a robber, right? You just you basically tie up the thing, and then you wash it. You know, after wearing it for a day, you wash it. Now that gives you actually that is the equivalent of 4-ply. Okay, when you have most of the masks which many of you are wearing are 3-ply. This is basically 4-ply. Okay, and if you've been reading the literature, actually cotton and wood are actually surfaces on which the virus doesn't survive very long, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Whereas plastic and metal, it can survive 3 days, 4 days. So I think it is actually better to switch to environmentally more sustainable solutions. But now, you know, because the public health messages is wear mask, wear mask, wear mask, you know, it's actually unnecessary. It's actually what is really required is so-called physical distancing. Okay, physical distancing, and when you have the proximity, you have the mask, and that can be achieved by other means. So I would suggest, Sharil, you and your fellow students in Indonesia should start a movement to wear masks, but masks made from cloth, you know, and you can start wearing some batik, you know, some old batik shirt. You can tie it up and do something innovative with it, you know. So you might even set a fashion statement and make some money from that, you know. But the point is that, you know, wearable masks made from cotton are much better option than the kinds of plastic and synthetic masks which are. But it's not a question of law, I'm afraid. Yeah? So I don't know what to say about the law as far as this is concerned. But there is a big problem. I mean, what you say, you know, especially Indonesia is an archipelagic country, Malaysia is surrounded by water. These are huge problems. The problem of plastic and plastic pollution and so on and so forth. I mean, okay, it's very not particularly nice to see a straw sticking out of the nose of a turtle. But leaving that kind of spectacular thing aside, you know, we are ingesting, when we eat fish, we are eating more and more plastic, you know, and, you know, this is a problem, you know, so the use of plastic is highly problematic, you know. But of course, there are other issues in terms of environment, which we have not gone into right now. But I just want to focus on this particular thing because you raised it in connection with COVID-19. Okay, Lizzie.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
Welcome, Sharon.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jomo. Oh, it looks like our panel, Florence. Okay, so next we have a question from another panelist, Silvana. The virus has been spreading since the end of 2019, and this largely impacted the international trade. So in order to face these conditions, many governments have given out stimulus packages through their central banks to try and solve this situation. However, do you feel that this is effective in solving the economic problem?
Okay, there are 2 or 3 different issues. Firstly, I'm not so sure that the major disruption is on international trade. The major disruption, due to the requirements of physical distancing, have actually been on production. Many people are no longer able to conduct their normal economic activities. International trade is actually not been disrupted by the virus itself, by the epidemic itself. What has happened, and this is maybe what Florence is referring to, what has happened is that 2 countries, very powerful countries, the US and Japan, have basically told their companies to get out of China. Okay, and many of us in Southeast Asia actually produce intermediate products for China, or China produces intermediate products for us in Southeast Asia, which we in turn export. Okay, so this is what there are words like value chains, supply chains, and all this kind of jargon which economists and others like to throw around. But the point is that there is that kind of disruption, but that kind of disruption is actually quite marginal. If you look at the ports, for example, it's not as if the ports shut down. It's not as if ships were not allowed to come in and so on. So it wasn't a disruption of international trade because of the pandemic. It was because of the political responses of the US and Japan, who are quite intent now on isolating China for various reasons. And this is the thing. So I think the attribution is important. Now, the other point which, sorry, Lizzie, the second part of the question was about
the stimulus.
It was about the stimulus package.
Yeah, about the stimulus package. Yeah, that's the stimulus package is actually okay. There are two parts. Okay? One is the so-called. Firstly, I think it's very important to recognize that there's no simple set solution. Okay, you basically learn by doing. Okay, you learn by doing. And it's not as if you can say, oh, this is the way you should do it based on the experience in 2008 or based on the experience in 1998. This is a very, very different type of crisis. So you cannot just simply mechanically take something from the past, say the Asian financial crisis or the global financial crisis and try to, it just doesn't work that way. So so whatever criticisms I make, I want to say that, sometimes many of these mistakes were made, because you're learning. The question is whether you can learn fast enough and correct your mistakes. And this is it's not easy to do. Okay. So I think what we have in the case of the so-called stimulus packages, there are basically two packages in Malaysia. One was called Prihatin, which was basically not a stimulus package. It's a relief package. Okay, the fact of disruption basically meant that many people were in need, and you need to be able to provide some kind of relief. Okay, relief because the livelihoods were destroyed, income was disrupted, and so on and so forth. So that relief is important. I don't think we were generous enough with the relief. We were generous with the wrong people. Okay, we should have been much more generous, as Lizzie raised earlier, with the people who are much more vulnerable. There was very little for the people who are self-employed, very little for the daily rated. Okay, much more was for the formal sector, for the big companies, and so on and so forth. So, but those are essentially fiscal measures. Now, monetary measures of giving credit and so on is undoubtedly also needed. Okay, but the question is, who needs credit for what? And this is where the whole question of the need to think about, for example, bankruptcy law becomes important, because when a business, big or small, is having problems and they want to try to get out of those problems, if you insist on equal status for all accumulated liabilities, that company will never be able to get out of that problem. But if you say, okay, the new debt we give priority to, okay, usually it's the other way around, right? Usually the old debt, you give priority to it. In this case, you're giving priority to new debt as a means to keep the business operations going. Okay, so of course there has to be some accountability, that the enterprise has to prove that the plan they have will enable them to get out of the problem. So these are some of the challenges involved. So the second package, which is called the Penjana package in the case of Malaysia, I think it's a bit, frankly, a bit pretentious. Okay, I mean, let's face it, we are in economic crisis, to say that you're going to generate new, significant new growth is not realistic. It's not realistic. I think that the big challenges are the following three. Number one, you have to make a very difficult decision that certain businesses are simply not going to be viable for some time to come. Okay, you know, you all too often when you talk to people, you listen to people talking, you hear things like, oh, you know, as soon as we get the vaccine, everything will be all right. You know, it's not going to be that easy. Just because you have a vaccine, let us say you have a vaccine before the US general election. So what? Who's going to be able to afford that vaccine, right? You know, I mean, it's not so easy, you know. So there are many issues as well. Who do you give priority to? For me, if you have a vaccine, the first priority is to frontline workers. Everybody working in the front line should be protected because they are the most vulnerable. And then you give priority to other people who have a lot of interactions with many people. But these are not necessarily highly paid people. These are not necessarily people with a lot of money. You see, so when you rely on the market mechanism to filter out who gets priority and so on and so forth, you actually have a very, very poor means of resolving some of these problems. So you really need to begin to think about different types of prioritization and prioritization not only in terms of the different, you know, if certain industries are simply not viable, you have to start thinking about repurposing them. For example, for some time to come, hotels are not going to be at full capacity. So many hotels maybe should be repurposed for some other purposes right now. Okay, and you know, forget about, you know, that tourism is going to pick up, you know, and save the economy in the second half of this year and things like that. These simply don't make sense. And just relying on Malaysian tourists is helpful for certain types of things, but it's not going to be an adequate substitute. So all those activities which are dependent on much personal interaction, close physical proximity, many of those things are simply not going to be very viable for quite some time to come. And we don't know, you know, I mean, let's face it, you know, you might not have a vaccine. You think about AIDS, okay? AIDS has been recognized since the 1980s. Almost 4 decades on, we still don't have a vaccine for AIDS, okay? And there are many other diseases as well where you don't have vaccines. So you cannot just, I mean, it's good that people are working on the vaccine, but there's no guarantee that there will be a vaccine. And there's no guarantee that what might appear to be a vaccine will work. Okay, so there are many unknowns, you know. So I think we have to deal realistically with the possibility that certain industries, certain activities are simply not going to be viable. That's challenge number one. The second challenge, and so those people who are working in those industries have to be phased out into other types of activities, have to be retrained, you know. I still like the example of a whole town in Sweden had to be closed down, but it was not very disruptive because the people in that town were trained for other purposes and they were subsequently redeployed in other in other jobs, which many of them appear to have you know, been quite successful at. So the likelihood of life changing very significantly, far more attention to, say, care services, you know, care services, which will become very, very important. People are living longer and longer in Malaysia. You know, women are living longer than men. What does that mean? How do we provide and ensure that while they are alive, people live, you know, fulfilling lives? You know, so all this needs to be, people need to think about these kinds of issues. The last issue, of course, which is extremely important, is how do you enable sorry, the second issue, just to reiterate, to make it clearer, is that you need to keep activities which are viable. We need to keep them going, or to enable them to restart. So the best analogy is like I know we don't have this in the tropics, but it's like a hibernation. Okay, if you think about an animal which goes into hibernation, basically what do? They go to sleep. They go to sleep for a few months, and then they come out of that sleep, and so on. So but right now it's not an easy option for businesses. Okay, because so many incomes and livelihoods are dependent on the functioning of those activities. So it's very, very difficult. That's why people say, oh, it's a choice between life and the economy. It's not a choice between life and the economy. If people who are living don't have the means of livelihood, it's also a choice for life. So, so there are different aspects which we need to look at. So the third aspect, I think, which is very important, of course, is what are the new activities? And I already mentioned care services as one area, but there are many other activities which need to be thought about much more. I have been advocating for a long time that we should be making a transition in terms of energy use. We should be less dependent on fossil fuel energy, and making the kind of transition to using, for example, much more solar. We are in the tropics. We have a lot of solar. We also have, and Malaysia right now is the #1 exporter of solar panels to the US. Okay, but unfortunately, not a single Malaysian company is doing it. It's all foreign companies who happen to be based in Malaysia. And the technology is not so difficult. It's not a question of technology. It's just a question of, Malaysian companies have not risen to the challenge. Or yet another issue which affects Indonesia much, much more. Indonesia is now the largest producer of palm oil. And in 2006, Europe decided to go with biodiesel. Okay, in the US, they decided to go for bioethanol. In Europe, they went for biodiesel. Palm oil palm oil-based biodiesel is viable. If Europe can go for 100% biodiesel, why can't Malaysians do that? Why can't Malaysians and Indonesians go for palm oil-based biodiesel? So the possibility of using of greater use of our oils is very, very important. So I think we really need to begin to think. I mean, Sharil raised the question earlier about the environment, but there are many, many concrete examples of how we should change our lifestyles in order to live much more sustainable lifestyles. Okay, Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jomo. Okay, now let's move on to a question from Ms. Duratul Hikmah, a representative of ALSA Universitas Erlangga as well. Her question is more centered around Indonesia. So in an attempt to prevent the economic retention caused by the pandemic, some local governments have ended the lockdown or the large-scale social distancing earlier and started and went forth with the new normal. For example, in Jakarta, which is the capital city of Indonesia. So she wants to know if you think that this was the best decision, and especially because the number of cases have been rising ever since the new normal has started. So do you think that the new normal makes a huge difference in terms of economical aspects?
Thank you, Duratul. I don't think, firstly, I don't like the use of the term new normal. Nothing is normal, okay? This kind of situation is abnormal. So if we think of normal as if it's something which is going to continue for some time, I think we're getting it wrong. We have to think of life, especially during this period during this difficult period, as a period where we have to on the one hand, try to restore economic activity, restore livelihoods, and try to move towards a much more sustainable lifestyles. That should be the priority of the moment. So don't use. I know everybody uses the word new normal. You know, it's a cliche, but I encourage all of you to think not to talk in terms of a normal, and maybe there will be a new normal. Okay, maybe after some time, maybe 5 years from now, you know, when things are normalized, there will be a new normal. But right now, we're not talking about new normal. But the question of a lockdown, as I said earlier, Northeast Asian governments and Vietnam, Laos, Kerala, all these places took very early action, very early preventive action. And therefore, by taking very early action, they didn't have to have a lockdown. And as I said, even in China, outside of Wuhan and the 3 surrounding provinces, because you have to remember that, you know, there were a lot of people commuting in and out of Wuhan. Okay, so it's an industrial city, but many people are coming in from the 3 surrounding provinces into Wuhan. So there was a need for a lockdown there, because this, you know, it's completely new problem, and nobody knew how to deal with it. And when they realized how big the problem was, they had a lockdown from the time of around Chinese New Year at the beginning of this year. But in the other provinces, no lockdown, except in Beijing, localized lockdown when they discovered the virus was there. Okay, and Vietnam, until last week, not a single death in Vietnam. You know, now they have 4 deaths or something like that, and they are talking about, you know, as if it's a great national tragedy. When there was one person who was a pilot for Air Vietnam who had COVID-19, and apparently one of the lungs was completely gone. You know, there were more than 40 people who volunteered to give their lungs. They thought the lung transplant was possible. They volunteered to give their lung to this guy, just to make sure there was not a single death in Vietnam. You know, this was the kind of sense of sacrifice. So what you found in many of these societies, Vietnam, Kerala, and so on, these are poor societies, but you had an all-of-government approach, a scientific approach, not based on some, you know, wishful thinking. And then you mobilize all of society. You help society to understand what the problem is, why we're asking you to have physical distancing, why we're doing this and that. Now, I must say that in Malaysia, at least, I was listening to a talk by Dr. Noor Hisham, the head of the health services in Malaysia. He actually did have an all-of-government approach. Whole of society approach is much more difficult and was not done here. But he was speaking together with the health minister of Kerala, and there they were far more successful in terms of mobilizing all of society. So you have many different approaches in different parts of the world, but just trying to go back to working like Mr. Trump has been doing, or Bolsonaro in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that's it's actually not helping at all. Now, when do you lift a stay in shelter lockdown? Because a stay in shelter lockdown is very, very damaging for the economy, undoubtedly. So you want to, that's why you need to do a lot of testing, you need to do a lot of tracing, you need to do a lot of treatment and so on, and tracking, okay? So all this needs to be done, but only by a very big intensive effort. And I'm just very sorry that Indonesia didn't do, we in Southeast Asia have no excuse. If Vietnam could do it, if India, Kerala could do it in India, I don't understand why we in the rest of Southeast Asia were not much more effective in terms of precautionary action. Of course, a relatively rich country like Korea, they could do a lot of testing. For them, they said we have 3 answers: test, test, test. Okay, but testing is expensive. So doing it in a very intelligent way is very important. And so you need to be able to, for example, reach out to religious leaders. I mean, religious groups have been the major super spreaders. If you think about what happened with the Tabligh group in Malaysia, if you think about what happened in the church in Korea, those were the major spreaders of. So you really need to talk to the religious leaders, get them to understand the issues, get them on your side, and get beyond superstition and so on. So this has been very successful in certain places. In Indonesia and in some other countries, including Malaysia, there are people who are also trying to take advantage. Okay, they come up with bogus solutions, trying to sell the products which they have and I think in the case of Indonesia, I don't know whether this was true, but I was told that that Indonesian leadership was told that some Fujifilm sold them 2 million of some treatment, okay, and it turned out that treatment is useless. It doesn't solve the problem. So it's very, very important to unfortunately there are opportunists around who are trying to make money from everything, So there are other people who claim to be representing this and that and the other. They claim to have this. At the beginning, when nobody knew what was going on or nobody understood what was going on, okay, we all make mistakes. That's why I say it's very important to have the ability to learn quickly and correct yourself. And we in Malaysia are lucky that Dr. Noor Hisham was responding very quickly. And one of the advantages we in Southeast Asia have is that Southeast Asian societies have had a number of viral epidemics in recent years, in the last 2 or 3 decades. I cannot even remember all of the names, MERS, SARS, H1N1, and so on and so forth. Sometimes I get even, I'm even confused by some of the names, But and we even have one which is the name is Nipah, named after the Nipah palm, and so even in Kerala, the health minister I was listening to, she was they had a Nipah epidemic just 2 years ago in 2018. So she said they had learned so much from that experience, and she was thanking the Malaysian Dr. Noor Hisham for the help that Malaysians gave during that time. So helping each other, learning from each other is very, very important. So we in Southeast Asia could have learned from Northeast Asia, but unfortunately we still have such a colonial mentality. Malaysian policy changed when? After the Imperial College of London study. Why do you have to wait for the Imperial College of London study? Of course, it was very important in terms of changing policy in Britain. But why should it be changing policy in Malaysia? But the elite here looks to London, looks to Washington, looks to New York, rather than looking at Japan and China and Seoul and so on and so forth. So this is a very unfortunate thing, an unfortunate problem of ways of thinking. Indonesia, maybe you're lucky you had a revolutionary war, you got rid of the Dutch and you don't have this kind of servile mentality to the Dutch, But unfortunately, in Singapore and Malaysia, this is a very major problem.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jomo. Now let's move on to 2 questions from our panelist, Natalie Jong. So Firstly, countries such as China and Vietnam, as you've mentioned earlier, are said to be quite successful in combating COVID-19 due to their citizens' deep commitment to collective action, which has made it easier for these governments to gain public compliance to certain extreme measures. In contrast, in the US, there have been anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests, as these measures are seen as civil liberty violations. So in your opinion, what is the best way for governments to balance public health with civil liberties? Second question. From early February 2020, publicly funded institutions in Vietnam developed at least 4 locally made COVID-19 tests that were validated by the government. Subsequently, private companies such as Viet A and Thai Duong offered capacity to manufacture the test kits. Would a scenario such as this have the potential to raise ISDS issues? That's all from Natalie Jong.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm not so sure the second question because I don't know the details about the situation here. I can't tell from your name whether you're Korean or anyway, in the case of Korea, they did develop their own kits. You know, in many of these areas, there are very unclear property rights. You know, in my view, you just go in and do what needs to be done. You just forget about the property rights and later fight it out. You know, if you keep on saying, oh, can I do this? You know, can I get a legal opinion on this and so on? You'll never do anything. You know, what needs to be done, you should go ahead and do. I mean, not in deliberate violation of the law, but you know, where there are many areas of ambiguity of the law. So I don't know the specificities of what you are talking about, both in the case of Vietnam as well as the Thai company and so on. But what I think is very important, and this is why I mentioned it just now in telling the story about Dr. Noor Hisham and the Kerala minister, is the fact that Asian to Asian solidarity, nobody even knows about it. There are no big headlines, nobody is writing articles about it, and it's not going to be on CNN. CNN doesn't care. And so on and so forth. So if you're looking to CNN or CNA or whatever it is for your news, you'll never hear about it, you know. But these kinds of things are extremely important, and 60 or 70 or years after independence, we should have, we should have developed much of this willingness to cooperate and help each other. Now, so I don't really know the answer to your second question. As far as the first question is concerned, I think the whole question is there are different traditions in many different societies of rights and responsibilities. US law is a very peculiar interpretation, and even between different states in the US and at different times in US history, you have had very, very different interpretations of the law. But just because, for example, you have a right to bear weapons, what does that right mean? Okay, so this question of civil liberties is very strong in the US because there's a strong civil libertarian movement which has become important, especially in the last 40, 50 years. And there are, there is such a thing as the public interest. There are things you cannot go around, if you want to commit suicide, even in Malaysia, you get arrested and fined if you fail. If you succeed, of course, nobody is going to be able to find you. But if you fail, you get caught. But supposing you try to commit suicide by blowing yourself up, you constitute a public nuisance. There are, that is it's public endangerment. So I think the civil society argument is often exaggerated. But the very good example is actually Korea, because Korea also has a strong civil liberties tradition, and it's understandable in the case of Korea because they were ruled by military dictatorship for about 3 or 4 decades, okay, from the 1960s until the 1980s, okay, 3 decades. So for them, civil liberties are quite important. But many of the people who, my friends who, for example, who were talking about civil liberties before, I was recently having a conversation, well, not recently, but last year having a conversation with some of them. They actually have changed their views about many things, you know, about shareholder rights, for example, you know, and somebody who was previously fighting for shareholder rights begins to realize that actually shareholder rights are very irresponsible, that what you should be talking about are stakeholder rights, you know, because there are other people in society, and it's not just a question of what you own which gives you rights. Existing in itself gives you rights also. So it's not a question, you know, this cult of property is actually extremely important for us to think about. So we shouldn't assume that these rights are absolute rights and so on. So I would say, you know, on the civil liberties question, I don't think it's very helpful for you to go to the US and say, oh, in Malaysia, we just ignore this, or, that's not terribly helpful. But I think within their own tradition of civil liberties, there are many grounds on which that kind of view that it is the right, it is in a sense a right which, you know, if you want to die, you know, nobody can stop you from dying. Okay, if you want to, well, Malaysian government can try to stop you because there's a law against attempted suicide. Yeah? But you know, but if you put other people at risk, immediately there are questions in law. So is that which law lies supreme? So it's not. I would say it is a question of the rights and responsibilities of each and every one of us are subject to societal considerations. And I don't want to make a big jurisprudential argument about it, but I think you can know where this is heading. So I would not be terribly bothered, Natalie, about that. Unfortunately, we don't have those kinds of extreme views. But you know, there are people, for example, who in Malaysia who are very upset that they are not able to exercise their right to prayer. To what do you call it? Collective prayer, to communal prayer. Well, I think if you go to any religious tradition, you will actually find that many of these things are actually recently invented. Yeah, I'll give you an example which is very interesting. You know the word quarantine, right? I think you all know the word quarantine, right? Where does the word quarantine come from? It comes from the word quarantina. Quarantina is an Italian word, okay? And it comes from Venice. So Venice was a very major port, you know, hundreds of years ago. And in Venice, they had ships coming from all over the Mediterranean. And some of the ships came from Istanbul. And in Istanbul, there were, you can find this in Ibn Khaldun's work, Muqaddimah. So there was a ship, there were ships, at the time when there was a plague there, they introduced restrictions, and ships were confined for 40 days, Arbaya. So this 40 days, so when the Doge of Venice heard about this, he introduced it and translated it into Italian, and from Arbaya it became, you know, quarantina, yeah, and then in English it became quarantine. So many of these things are actually very much part of religious history. It's not as if you know, the public health is against religion. So many of these people who say things like, oh, you know, God will protect me. God never said that we should do anything to protect ourselves. That's complete nonsense, you know. But of course, you know, it's if you go and say it, you probably, nobody's going to listen to you, right? So you really need to work with the people of influence in these communities to be able to persuade them that that it's necessary for them to exercise responsible leadership in these extraordinary times. Lizzie?
All right, thank you very much for that, Dr. Jomo. Now we'll move on to our final panelist. Mr. Ui Guoshen would like to ask you the question himself. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, Doctor. Basically, actually, I wanted to ask two, perhaps even more, but due to time constraints, because we have a few questions from the viewers themselves, so I'll just ask one. Is question one is about because right now our country is basically raising a lot of debt to help the people get through hard times, but in this process, is there actually a risk that will be causing other problems, like maybe the nation's credit would be affected? And yeah, because yesterday the Malaysian government actually tabled a new legislation to be heard in the first reading. It's about increasing the debt ceiling. So I was a bit worried about what are the effects of this. Yeah, so I hope Doctor can give us an insight about this.
Yeah, thank you, Goshen. I don't personally. A lot of these things are artificially imposed. Okay, there's nothing which requires a certain kind of ceiling as such. The big problem in Malaysia is that that debt has not been subjected to careful auditing. Okay, so let's remember there are two types of debt which the government gets involved with. One is what is called public debt or government debt. Okay, the government borrows, and that's all quite well known. And that's where the ceiling applies. Okay, but there's a second kind of debt, which is called government guaranteed debt, where the government is equally liable. But unfortunately, that is not subject to audit by the National Auditor General. It is not subject to controls and so on and so forth. Okay, so if I were you, I would pay far, far more attention to bringing the second category of government guaranteed debt, which was involved in 1MDB and the whole range of other things, under control. That's where it needs to be done. It doesn't mean absolutely no debt, because if companies need to expand, let us say you're starting a new, there's a new product and you want to start producing to that product, let us say from the seabed, okay? You obviously need a lot of investment and so on and so forth, and it may be necessary to go into debt to start the company off. But that kind of, so I'm not saying no debt whatsoever, but right now what we have is a lot of borrowings which is being done, which is guaranteed by the government, which actually is not subjected to any. Why Parliament has done nothing about it all this time, I have no idea. Okay, because this has been a problem which has become very serious particularly since the 1980s. Perhaps since the 70s, but especially since the 1980s. So the second, so going back to the first, I think even on the first type of debt, it should always be subjected to parliamentary debate and control. So what happened, for example, in February, Tun Mahathir agreed that there was a need to address the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, I think in January there was still not much attention on the part of the government, but by the DOA, the Ministry of Health, but not by the rest of the government. But by February, at least the Prime Minister was quite concerned about it, and he asked the Finance Minister and the finance minister said he was bringing in some legislation in March. The Prime Minister asked the finance minister to expedite it and to have it by February. And so, but then there was basically a coup d'etat and there was a change of government. So that legislation never went through. But it basically would have meant that many of the processes which would have been, the approval for the funding, additional funding, would actually have gone through Parliament and subject to debate. Okay, whereas the way it was done was that the new government was afraid of convening Parliament and went ahead and spent the money, which I think it should have spent the money. I should have spent money. I don't agree with the way the spending priorities, but the fact of needing to spend money was in itself a good thing. So I would not be so concerned about being obsessed with a limit, but I would actually want to have far more public scrutiny of how the debt is being spent, how the debt is being deployed. For example, at a time when many people, the daily rated workers and self-employed and so on, were not getting very much, government servants were all given a 200 ringgit allowance, during the MCO. Why? So I would say that there are many things, misplaced priorities, but overall, the need for the government to spend to help the country, to help the economy, to help businesses, and especially to help the layperson go through this crisis period and to restore economic activity is actually not only desirable, but quite necessary. And if borrowing has to be done, so be it. But I'm not so keen on many of the monetary measures because many of the monetary measures are very unspecified. You can pretty much borrow anything at lower cost now, and it may not necessarily help economic activity. Let me say I buy over your shares and you buy over my shares. How does that contribute to enhancing the economy? It really doesn't. So unfortunately, you have a lot of lending, which is a bit mindless in the sense of being able to contribute to economic recovery. But your question is an important one, and it requires more checks and balances on sovereign debt, on government debt, and how the debt is deployed. And in fact, internationally right now, if you borrow internationally, the cost of debt is quite low. Okay, but I would actually favor Malaysian debt bonds rather than buying internationally, than borrowing internationally. Okay, Lizzie?
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Jomo. Okay, so now we are running out of time, but we still have questions that the audience would like you to answer. So in that case, would you mind answering just one more from the audience?
Okay, why don't you, since you've had a chance to look at all the questions which the audience has, why don't you give me a few and I'll just choose one or two which I feel might be interesting.
Okay, all right. So far we've collected two here. So from Aswin Kumar, first, should super spreaders who break quarantine be arrested and charged since they are putting the public in danger of transmission? This is in the context of Malaysia. And secondly, can illegal immigrants seek protection in the name of basic human rights amidst this pandemic and with enforcements of governmental bodies trying to remove them from the country, considering how some of these people are victims of specific agencies that have quote unquote cheated them and lured them to different countries where such undocumented immigrants are also victims of similar modus operandi. That's all.
Okay, thank you. On the second question of illegal immigrants, I think the fact of the matter right now is that we have most of the illegal immigrant workers are quite badly abused, either by the labor contractors or by others. You know, so I'm quite sympathetic to their plight, but they don't have any rights, unfortunately for them, under Malaysian law. Well, I shouldn't say absolutely no rights, but there are very few rights, very, very few rights. As you know, Malaysia is not even a signatory to the Convention on Refugees. So despite saying that, you know, we are very sympathetic to some refugees and so on, actually very little, those even the refugees don't have much rights in Malaysia. As far as the first question is concerned about super spreaders, I think it's not clear to me that there are many instances of deliberate super spreaders. Okay, I think you have irresponsible super spreaders. Okay, but that's different. A deliberate super spreader is different from okay, so I don't know whether you've followed these cases about these American parties. Okay, young people about your age, they have these parties, and then everybody money to bet, and then the one who gets tested for COVID-19 first wins the prize, wins the pool of money. Okay, it's a very perverse kind of thing. Okay, so it's actually a perverse incentive for spreading COVID-19. And one of them, I mean, the reason all this came to light was because one of them died a couple of weeks ago, and before he died, he actually wrote something about it and basically criticized his own irresponsible behavior. But you know, there are of course deliberate super spreaders in that sense of the word, but most of the super spreading is not deliberate. Just people who are irresponsible. They don't think about the consequences of their own behavior. They're selfish, but I think it is not terribly helpful to penalize them in a draconian way. I think what is more helpful is to highlight what happened and to embarrass them. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, there are people who, I have a friend who was wrongly dubbed a super spreader. He was one of the first people to be confirmed positive. And I asked him to write about his own experience. And he wrote about his own experience, and everybody presumed that because he was writing about his own experience that he was a super spreader, which he wasn't. In fact, he got it from somebody else, and everybody now agrees that somebody else had passed it to him. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a chance to go and, you know, correct the record. So are still saying that he was a super spreader, when in fact it was not true. So I think the more important thing is to, you know, there is very little public education. We desperately need public education on health issues generally, and especially COVID-19 issues, because in so many ways, COVID-19 is quite unique. It has so many characteristics which are very unique, and people need to understand what they're dealing with. And there is, unfortunately, a great deal of ignorance about what COVID-19 entails. So it becomes very, very necessary to use opportunities. You know, before, when I was working in the United Nations, I was in charge of a conference on nutrition. And during the process, I learned that you know, there are very knowledgeable people who are advisors to many of the popular television programs. And the whole point is to put in public health messages into these very popular programs. So, for example, one was about law and order, special victims unit or something like that. It's basically about sexually transmitted diseases and related issues, and psychological and other problems. So this was one important way of doing so. So for example, in Malaysia, right now, we have one of the highest levels of diabetes in Asia. We have one of the highest levels of obesity in Asia. And, we really need people to be aware of this. Every time I go out with my son and others, we go to some of these places and we see these long lines of people queuing up for, before COVID-19 for bubble tea. It's a complete junk food, I mean, it is just full of sugar, but, people don't think of it that way. So the older generation of ethnic Chinese in this country, you don't have huge problems with obesity. But now with the younger generation, the problem is beginning to spread. And among ethnic Indians and ethnic Malays in this country, the problems are very, very serious. So I think what you really need a lot of in this country is public health messages and exemplary public health practices. And unfortunately, naming and shaming is quite effective, and people will. So I would say, don't be so tough on super spreaders unless it is really deliberate, which is rarely the case, but rather use them to name and shame in order to educate the people. There's so much education to be done right now. And even the scientific knowledge about COVID-19 and its consequences is changing all the time. And so we really need constant messaging. Just having an official reading the latest reports on how many people were infected and so on and so forth, that frightens people, that is important, but it's not good enough. You need positive messages, also about what needs to be done, how to behave, how to socialize, that the risk you're taking to your grandparents or when you visit them unnecessarily, how much more vulnerable older people are compared to younger people, and so on and so forth. A lot of these messages need to be transmitted. Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much to ALSA. Thank you, Lizzie, for hosting this. I hope this has been of some use to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Jomo. So with that, we have reached the end of our event. Unfortunately, time is not on our side and we are unable to answer most of the viewers' questions, but still we are very grateful for your participation in today's event. This has been a very insightful conference. On behalf of ALSA UM, we would like to really thank the main speaker, Dr. Jomo, and all the panelists for participating in today's event. We would also like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to all of you, the audience, for joining us this afternoon. Finally, we would like to express our sincerest appreciation towards ALSA Universitas Erlangga for sharing their presence with us, as well as ALSA Malaysia for conferring us the opportunity to materialize this informative milestone. We hope that this event will catalyze an intellectual discourse surrounding the role of law in battling the COVID-19 pandemic and has contributed to a more informed public. That's all from us today, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great weekend ahead. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.